discussion. There we go, that's the machine just telling us it's being recorded. Today, we're joined, there's my dog, joined by the dog. We're joined by Professor Peter Edge, Dr Alex Powell, and Dr Catriona Mackie. We're going to discuss women in Manx politics and the thorny question of the existence or otherwise of small island democracy. And I'm very pleased to welcome all three speakers to this webinar. I know Catriona because Catriona contributes to my module on island governance in the Masters, and she delivers a comprehensive overview of Manx history, culture and politics. So I'm very much looking forward to what she and her two colleagues are going to tell us today. So remember, this is an opportunity to ask questions and find out more about our island friends. So while listening, please put your questions in the chat and we'll try and pick up on those in due course. So thank you very much. So welcome.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. Right, let me just make sure this is working. Right, can you all see that title slide? Is that working all right?
Yes.
Yes. Excellent, okay, thank you. So thank you all for coming, and a huge thanks to Andrew for inviting us to speak to you today. We're actually going to be talking about a project that's in its very early stages, and I think all of us have found it quite helpful to have to put together this presentation. And it'll be quite helpful for us if you could give us some feedback and comments and questions afterwards, I think, as well. So we're a four-person team from three different institutions, but only three of us are here today. So Mary unfortunately couldn't make it today. And we were very lucky last year to receive funding from Culture the island's cultural development agency for this project. So what I'd like to do today is very briefly introduce the project. And then I'm going to hand over to Peter to tell you a little bit about the context, the history, the current political system and things like that. I'll then come back and dive in a little bit more to the project aims in a bit more detail, exploring some of the questions that we're hoping to answer. And then Alex is going to come in and talk about the methodology, how we're hoping to answer these questions. So let me briefly introduce the, that didn't work. Give me just 1 second. I'm not sure why that didn't move on there. Okay, let me try that again. For some reason, it's not letting me move to the next slide. What if I click the mouse? There we are. Okay, that'll do it. So, so we've got four sort of key project aims, highlighting the lack of gender diversity historically and today, and we'll see some examples of that a little bit later on. Exploring the experiences of women in Manx politics, particularly in the modern era and particularly from 2000 onwards, and essentially to identify what kinds of barriers women experience in becoming involved in Manx politics, and what can we do to try and remove those barriers and encourage more women to stand for election on the Isle of Man. It is a multidisciplinary project, not just a multi-institution project, bringing together expertise in law, including Manx law, social history, including modern Manx social history, but also gender studies and qualitative methodologies. And we do have a project website, so please do have a look. There's a blog on there that's updated reasonably regularly, so you'll get updates on what we're up to if you have a look at that. And I will now hand over to Peter to talk about the context. Hopefully. Peter, can you hear me?
He may just need to unmute himself.
Okay. Let me just go and see if I can find out what's happening with him.
Hello, Peter. Can you hear us? Ah, my goodness. So your VC rooms are very close, next door to each other.
Thank you. Hi, folks. Sorry about that. As you can see, Oxford is slightly closer than is generally assumed to be the case. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the context of our project. How do I?
Yeah, I think it's
Click. Ah, brilliant. So the Isle of Man is not the Channel Islands, although it's frequently bundled together because legally and constitutionally there's quite a lot of similarities. It's a territory at the pivot of the Atlantic archipelago. This means that our history with our neighbours is very complicated. So at various times, pretty much every one of the larger kingdoms around us has claimed ownership of the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man was being used as a Viking settlement, preying on the surrounding territories for some time. It securely entered the English realms 14th century, but it wasn't simply integrated into England. Instead, it was kept as a private possession of English lords, so it retained autonomy and identity as a proprietary right of a major English magnate. So this distinctiveness continued even past 1765. In 1765, closer rule was introduced from London. So rather than there being a king or lord of man who was separate from the English king, it was merged in what's called a revestment, but it retained a distinct identity. And really, I think insularity was key to understanding this. You had the flux before becoming an English possession, which is only really explicable for an island nation, and the development of distinctive identity institutions, including most importantly a thing, the Tynwald, which was based largely on Norse structures. And insularity, I think, remained key later on. The purchase by the British Crown was not carried out as part of any grand unification scheme or anything like that. It's much more straightforward. Up until 1765, the Isle of Man were making a lot of money by offshoring trade. They regarded it as a legitimate trade that was lawful under Manx law. The English authorities regarded it as smuggling, which was taking massive amounts of revenue out of English coffers. So if you see any similarities with 21st century discussions of international finance centres, you're spot on. What this means is that post 1765, although the Isle of Man had been bought to stop the smuggling, there was no interest in what actually happened in the Isle of Man. If it kind of broke even and it wasn't a problem, that was fine. So what we actually got is we got survival of the ancient Manx institutions because they were a really convenient tool for governing the Isle of Man. It meant that they had survived up until the 1860s, when gradually autonomy was given to Manx institutions over English institutions. So Tynwald had survived this process of direct rule and was there to take power back into its own hands. Tynwald is the central governance organ in the Isle of Man. It probably is fairly similar to Parliament. There are some important differences. It's easy in the post-devolution settlement to think of it as being sort of an early form of devolution. Actually, its powers are much more extensive than that. So, for instance, from the 19th to 20th century, Tynwald pursued a distinct policy on capital punishment, which was something it had authority over. It has authority over tax setting and things like that. It consists of two chambers. The House of Keys consists of 24 members called MHKs. Up until 1867, it was a self-perpetuating oligarchy. When there was a vacancy, it would be filled by nominations by the members. The franchise was extended to some women in 1881, which we insist means that the Isle of Man was the first Anglophone territory to have elections to the national legislature. Extended further and introduced the possibility of women candidates in 1919. In 1961, the House of Keys became the dominant body, so analogous to the House of Commons, House of Lords changes. In 1961, the House of Keys became dominant. In 1986, responsible government ceased to be based primarily on the powers of the Lieutenant Governor and instead became a Manx executive responsible to Tynwald. Franchise extended to 16-year-olds in 2006. One point which is important is that the Keys has always been overwhelmingly comprised of independence. There are political parties. There is not a dominant party system. There certainly isn't a two-party system. So independence and individuals are very important in elections to the keys. They share legislative authority with the Legislative Council. Up until 1919, you had a dizzying mix of compositions over the centuries. But what they had in common is that they were members of, the membership was composed of officers of the Crown. In 1919, as a result of constitutional pressure from the Isle of Man, this became hybrid. So you had these official members joined by people appointed by MHKs. And there was a gradual erosion of the number of official members, those who owned their place to the Lieutenant Governor's appointment, and those who'd been appointed by the Keys. So you have a very distinct situation in the Isle of Man where the lower chamber actually elect the upper chamber. In 1919, in the same year in which the Tynwald opened up membership of the House of Keys to women, they decided not to open up the new roles in the Legislative Council to women. And astonishingly, women were not eligible to join the Legislative Council until 1961. There is an argument for saying that it wasn't fully open to women until 2015 with the opening up of the Lord Bishop of Sodor and Man to women, but I won't go there today. So today you have the President of Tynwald, who has a casting vote, who's elected by Tynwald members, the Lord Bishop of Sodor and Man, who is an Anglican bishop, the Attorney General, who has no vote, and 8 appointees of the Keys.
Thanks very much, Peter. So what do we want to find out? There are various strands for this project, and the two that I'm going to focus on primarily today are the historical strand and the contemporary strand. So first of all, the historical strand. Now, if we look at the history of women in Manx politics, there are a number of key moments that stand out. So although, as Peter noted, women became eligible to stand for election in 1919, it wasn't until 1929 that we see the first women standing. Now, in that year, 40 candidates stood for 24 seats, 39 men and 1 woman, Louisa Nelson, standing for the Ramsey constituency. Now, she wasn't elected, and in fact, she came third in this constituency with just 48 votes. Both of the men that she was standing against each received more than 1,000 votes. Now, in 1933, Marion Shimmin was elected as MHK for Peel after a local by-election. Now, her husband, Christopher Shimmin, had been elected as MHK for Peel at every general election since 1919. He was a founding member of the Manx Labour Party, the first formal political party to be established on the island. And upon his death in 1933, his wife was elected unopposed as Labour candidate. At the general election the following year, in 1934, she was again elected unopposed, making her the first woman to win a seat in the House of Keys in a general election. Now, in 1946, we have 5 women candidates standing for election alongside 50 men. And this was the first time that more than 1 woman stood for election at any one point. None, sadly, were elected. But 5 years later, although only 1 woman stood for election, Anne Bridson, she was elected and became the first married woman to be elected to the House of Keys. So the historical strand of the project involves interrogating the public records, the newspaper archives, to see if we can identify any trends in women standing for the House of Keys. So we'll be looking at how many women were standing for election, whether more than 1 woman was standing in any one constituency, what their success rates were like. And importantly, and this kind of ties in really nicely with our contemporary work, we're going to be looking for information about the issues that inspired women to stand for election, what platforms did they campaign on, and how were they represented in the Manx press? And what were the attitudes of the general public, the politicians, as well as the press, to those women who stood for election and to those who were ultimately elected? For the 21st century, we want to explore these issues in much more depth by interviewing those women who stood for election and those who were ultimately elected between 2000 and 2001. 2000 and 2021, I should say. Now, in 2016, Lord Lisvane was appointed to conduct a review into the functioning of Tynwald, and he reported in June that year, highlighting the lack of gender representation in Tynwald, noting that this was a major problem and an issue of such importance that both Tynwald and civil society need to address it with energy. And you can see from the table on the right that at the time of Liz Vane's review, just over 50% of the population of the Isle of Man were women, and yet they represented less than 6% of the elected members of Tynwald. In the previous election in 2011, of the 64 candidates, only 13 had been women, less than 11%, and only 2 women were ultimately elected, along with 22 men. And as Peter highlighted, at that point, there were no women sitting in the Legislative Council. However, shortly after Liz Vane's review, in the general election of September 2016, just over 20% of the candidates were women, and 5 women were ultimately elected to the House of Keys. That was a record number. 2 years later, 5 seats became available on the Legislative Council, and for the first time, this recruitment process was open to anybody. 60% of the candidates were women, 9 out of 15 candidates, and all 5 appointees were women. More recently, we saw 10 women elected to the House of Keys in last year's general election, another record number, with a significant number of women standing for election. Nearly 25% of candidates were women. 2 of those candidates, interestingly, were members of the Legislative Council, leaving 2 empty seats on Lightcoat to be filled. And in the Legislative Council elections later that year, 4 men and 3 women chose to stand, with 1 man and 1 woman being elected. So we have seen significant progress over the last 6 years, but there is still some way to go. Now, at the September 2021 election, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association was asked to observe and report, and they noted the improvement of the number of women elected, despite there being no positive measures to promote women's participation. But they also noted reports that women candidates were being targeted on social media, and that some had their posters defaced or destroyed. And they ultimately recommended a review to strengthen women's participation in elections. And that is something that hopefully this project will be able to contribute to. So a large part of the contemporary strand is to explore women's experiences, beginning with the decision-making process. Why do women decide to stand for election? What potential advantages and disadvantages do they consider? Who do they discuss it with? How does prior experience influence their decision? And we then want to look at their experiences campaigning. What issues have they campaigned on? What impact, if any, did their gender have on their experience of the campaign process? Were there other women candidates standing in the same constituency, and did that have any impact? And how did others react to their candidature, whether it be family or friends, or other candidates, politicians, and of course, the Manx press? And for those women who are elected, whether to the House of Keys or the Legislative Council, what was their initial experience in politics? How did other politicians react to their appointment? Were there any specific expectations made of them as women? Were there any assumptions being made about their policy interests, for example? So in short, here are some of our key questions, our key overarching questions for the modern era. We're really looking to explore influences on women, concerns that they may have had, challenges that they might face, and attitudes towards them, to try and get to the heart of women's experiences, both in terms of external pressures on women, but also internal pressures. How do women see themselves in the political arena, and has that changed over time? And ultimately, we hope to determine what are the barriers to women entering Manx politics, and what can we do to remove those barriers. We also have some broader questions relating to the Manx political context. As most politicians stand as independents, and party politics plays a very small role in the Manx political arena, to what extent does this impact on the involvement of women in Manx politics? Are women being disadvantaged because of the lack of party politics? And if women are not part of a political party, what role does their prior political experience and knowledge have, maybe in local politics, for example? What impact does that play on their decision to stand for election? Do they have any experiences in local politics? Do they have family members involved in politics? The image that you can see here is of Claire Christian, who became the first and so far the only woman president of Tynwald in 2011. Now, Claire and her sister Anne Crane both spent many, many years in Tynwald, and they come from a significant political family. Their father, Charles Carrush, was one of the most influential politicians of the 20th century. So what impact does that family legacy have on women's decisions whether or not to stand and how to go about that campaign process? And lastly, how does the Isle of Man compare to other small democracies? To what extent can our Manx case study inform other small democracies? And I'm now going to hand over to Alex to discuss our methodology.
Thank you very much, Catriona. So obviously we've, as identified, we have a number of strands going on here, and methodologically, most of what I'm going to say is in relation to this more contemporary strand, specifically thinking about how do we gather and then analyse and understand women's experiences of engaging in Manx politics. Could I have the next slide, please? So firstly, the question of how we're going to gather information. Now, the contemporary strand will focus very, very strongly on interviews, specifically semi-structured interviews. So although there are pre-written questions, we're also looking to be guided by our participants, and the focus is very much on finding out on what their experiences are and the terms in which they articulate those experiences. As a result of this, we're looking to have quite lengthy interviews of around 2 hours in duration. Obviously, that's not a fixed or predetermined amount of time. Rather, that is an average that's intended to give people the space to express their own experiences, as well as the kind of potential to follow on any important issues that come up. The interviews will be conducted on island by Catriona. However, obviously we are mindful of kind of ongoing coronavirus situations as well. So in the event that there was anything that maybe the situation turned out to be worse again, there'd also be the possibility of doing such interviews over a web platform like Zoom. But ideally they would take place on island, which obviously has that sort of link to people's experiences and that ability to situate the interviews in that wider context of being very, very related to the island itself. May I have the next slide again, please? Now, obviously, as well as what the interviews will be, it's important to think about who we want to speak to. So we're going to speak to a range of different groups in these 20 interviews. We're going to firstly look to speak to women who've historically been involved in Manx politics. So that might be women who've been engaged in politics over several decades, those who might have been elected, say, in the 1980s, 1990s, or even earlier. We also want to look at, though, women who've become more recently involved. So, you know, as mentioned, in the last year, we've had a particularly significant election, which returned 10 new women to the House of Keys. What are maybe their experiences as newer members, and how do the experiences of the two groups speak to one another? What changes have there been over time? Alongside this, we'd be interested in speaking to women who spent time in both legislative houses. So obviously, as well as the House of Keys, there is the Legislative Council. And another feature of the most recent election is the movement of some members of the Legislative Council into the House of Keys. So how does their experience within the Legislative Council then lead them on to be within the House of Keys? What sort of things have influenced them in making that transition? And a final kind of stakeholder group in this regard that we're interested in speaking to are those who've actually come to the House of Keys via some time in local government. So potentially some engagement in a more local form of politics. How did their experiences there maybe lead them on to becoming involved in island level politics, and what does that experience do in terms of how they conceive of and imagine their political engagement? Now, obviously, in sourcing these experiences, we'll have to be somewhat led by the willingness of participants to get engaged. But these are the groups we're predominantly looking to speak to for the interviews, and hopefully to get a wide range of people who've come from these different backgrounds and who bring these experiences. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you very much. Obviously, we don't want to be reductive here. Those groups are very, very important, but actually to generate this broader understanding of women's engagement in Manx politics, we also need to have a view to the wider contextual factors. Now, as Catriona mentioned in our questions, we're also interested in potentially whether people were influenced to get involved via family members, whether they might have an influence in their wider day-to-day life. And one way to engage with this actually is to look at some wider contextual factors which are viewed as a supplement to, rather than a sort of replacement for, the interviews. So as well as the 20 interviews, we're looking actually to conduct 2 focus groups. And these focus groups will firstly be with the families of women involved in Manx politics. So particularly partners, but also, say, children over the age of 18, potentially families. And the question there is sort of, what do the families feel might have influenced their family members' decision to stand for politics? What considerations were maybe had within the family when deciding whether or not to stand for engagement in Manx politics, and what might have influenced the final decision. And another group we're looking to speak to as well are those women who decided not to stand. So there we're particularly thinking of people who might have weighed it up, who potentially even got some of the steps down the line, began speaking to people, possibly even took the paperwork to register as a candidate, but then didn't do so. And what we want to know there is, why did they choose not to stand? What was it that influenced them? As a question, was it something relating to potentially family life? Was it something relating to potentially the experiences of other women in politics? Did they speak to women who had gone on to be elected, and did that influence them? Just there to get an idea of why did they eventually choose not to stand. And the way in which we'll try and gather participants actually for these focus groups is by speaking to our interview participants and asking them to sort of refer on people who might be interested in participating in the focus groups. So that should tally quite nicely, because it means, for example, that the family members we speak to will be the family members of the interview participants, and will be able to sort of share their experiences together. And similarly, the people who didn't stand will be people we've maybe learned about by speaking to those who did go on to stand, and might help us to get some interesting insights into that sort of intersubjective conversation between the two parties. What was it that led one of them to stand and another one not to? Can I have the next slide, please? So obviously this is drawing together a lot of data, 20 interviews, 2 focus groups. That's a lot of information. And I think it's important, therefore, to sort of note what we're going to do with that information. Now, we are taking here a qualitative conception of knowledge production. So we're not looking to generate numerical insights. This is not about sort of what percentage of women chose to stand after considering it. Rather, what we're really interested in is gaining some insights into how women who work within Manx politics actually understand their own experiences. So how do they make sense of the political picture into which they've emerged? How do they engage with potentially some of the press coverage of women being engaged in politics? How do they engage with, for example, working in a historically male-dominated area? What results and implications does that have? In order to do this, we're going to look to use a narrative analysis approach. So a narrative analysis approach basically focuses in on revealing something of each of their experiences. And this is why the 2-hour interviews are important, because we really want to pick up on how do they make sense of their own experiences and to draw that out. And obviously, in doing that, what we're saying is that we're focused as much on sort of developing almost a subjective self-understanding as much as we are general analytic insights. But actually, developing research of this kind, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that this is all about human experience, and therefore we try and build our insights from those experiences. So I think the narrative analysis approach is precisely that, to focus in on their individual experiences, and from that to try and build a picture of what this tells us about the political landscape as it is found by women contemporarily entering Manx politics. I will now, next slide, please. Thank you. Yes, I'll now pass back to Peter, who's going to kind of talk about what's next with the project. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you. So what do we hope to produce from this project? It's a combination of academic contribution, so contributing to the state of the art, which we feel has been dominated by looking at women in large democracies, rather than small democracies. But also, we're really keen to be involved in this very active policy debate, which, as Catriona said, is happening in the Isle of Man, but can also be found more broadly. So, for instance, the CPA has taken this on board and is doing some work of its own on this. So we are hoping to produce open access policy briefings, looking at identifying and addressing barriers for participation of women in Manx politics, and as a result of discussing those barriers, encouraging more women to enter Manx politics. Our earlier slides sort of showed, I think, the importance of people coming forward in order to be considered as candidates, because if women are not coming forward, they will not be elected. We will be producing lectures, podcasts, blog posts, and social media coverage. So we do have a project page, which I'll refer to in a minute, and we do regularly blog as we go on that. Because a lot of our foundational work for the 21st century is looking at the electoral data and the 20th century underpinnings, our current blogs are pretty historically orientated, but obviously that will change after we've had a chance to engage with this rich data and start to make sense of it. Academic articles, which will include those based on interview transcripts and focus groups, which analyse, as we said, how Manx women politicians view themselves, understand themselves, their island, their belief in the future of women politics. And what I think might be of interest to this audience in particular, we want to reflect on lessons from the Isle of Man as a small island democracy without a dominant party system. So are the things that other small island democracies, most obviously Jersey and Guernsey, for instance, might benefit from the Manx experience. I would just say that when we were developing, this project's been in gestation for a while, and when we were developing it and actually pitched it for funding, this was before the fantastic 2021 results. So we were actually looking at studying a really bleak situation, and we were really excited to go, okay, we can study that bleak situation, and maybe there's this moment of change that we can study, and we can actually identify something dynamically that's happening here. So I think that was very exciting for us, as well as being intrinsically morally good, but also, as academics, we thought, hey, cool. And just some links. So we have a project website and individual emails for the team. Thank you very much.
Right, let me see if I can stop sharing. That's us, right.
Thank you very much, everyone. Wow, a fascinating piece of research that you're undertaking, and a very timely and important one as well. I think there'll be parallels and sort of useful information coming out of your research that could be applied not just to other Crown dependencies, but things like Shetland, Orkney, and the Western Isles councils as well. Now, clearly, they don't have anywhere near the power of the Manx Parliament, but nonetheless, they cover archipelagos, and they do have a lot of power within that. Big budgets, and female participation, as far as I'm aware, is pretty low in these councils. So I'm sure this will be very important. And I see Beth has got her hand up.
Thanks very much, and I just wanted to thank you all for a really interesting presentation about your project. I think it's very timely, obviously, at the moment we've got International Women's Week next week and upcoming local elections here, so it's really useful to think about that. And really, I guess Andrew's mentioned already, in Shetland we've got very few, relatively speaking, candidates coming forward for elections, and again we've got that similar picture of mostly independent candidates, and I was interested to hear your reflections on that, looking back at you mentioned Marion Shimon, who was a Labour candidate and aligned to her husband, who was a Labour candidate, and potentially the influence of that on her election at that time, but also again thinking about the challenges of women entering politics now that maybe don't have that backdrop of a party to support them in terms of presenting a policy arena, but also in terms of I guess maybe a mentorship through the political system of having people around you that are in a similar system. So I was just interested to hear some more thoughts on that aspect of your research.
I can go with that.
Yeah, go.
The independents dominate at the elected stage. They also dominate at the actual candidates coming forward stage. So the parties have always been small. We had a peak in 1946, which was, the post-war elections were pretty momentous across the British Isles, I think. But what we found if you take parties generally, there doesn't appear to be any significant difference at all in the number of women running as representatives of parties and being elected as parties. It seems fairly flat at that point. The big exception is the Manx Labour Party. The Manx Labour Party is, in a context where political parties are not that important, it is by far the most important political party. It's contested every election since 1919. No other parties existed for that entire period. It's put forward very large numbers of candidates, including a very, proportionally a large number of women. There is some hint, and the numbers are really small, so I'd have to be very careful on the stats in this. There is some hint that women put forward by the Manx Labour Party stood more chance of being elected than women generally and candidates generally. So I think there are some interesting stories to be found out about, in particular, the approach to the MLP. I think it's fair to say that the cluster of smaller parties tended to be to the right of the MLP. So there might be something happening there as well, particularly in the 50s and 60s. The other thing I would say is that if you look around the Atlantic Archipelago at measures to try to improve the number of women candidates being put forward, parties are used as a key mechanism, because it is seen as dodgy to try to intervene with the electorate, but less dodgy to intervene with this mediating force in the middle. So, for instance, you have things like, yes, we will provide funding for political parties, but you have to have a certain proportion of female candidates. Or, yes, we'll, you put forward as a list, it has to be alternating male-female, which you see elsewhere. And the thing that I think is really interesting and perhaps might be relevant elsewhere, because parties are so minor in the Isle of Man, those tools are not to hand. So there actually needs to be something much more intimate and direct at play, I think. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. Yeah, and I think also Manx Labour Party in particular, again, has at least some political machinery behind it to be able to support women who decide to go forward, but also to local elections as well. And I think the more women that we're seeing coming into local politics going forward, it's going to be really interesting to see to what extent are they representing a political party, particularly the Labour Party, but also to what extent do they then decide to move forward into national politics at the end of that as well.
Thanks very much for your answers, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the outputs. I think they'll be really useful across the spectrum of political engagement, and I'll be really, and the councils, I would imagine, would have quite a strong interest in this because they're very much trying to encourage more female candidates to come forward. So really looking forward to seeing the outputs for this project when they come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have amongst our attendees some interesting folk, people who are doing doing either a Master's in Island Studies or in fact doing a PhD in Island Politics. And I see Adele has asked if she can ask a question rather than just stick it in the chat, because it's much easier to say it by, through the voice, the medium of the voice. So
can you hear me okay?
There she is. Yes, indeed, Adele. Fire away.
Yeah, what a fascinating presentation. That was really, really interesting. And Beth picked up on those points about that you mentioned about the mechanism of party politics, which is obviously absent for us in the Isles as well. So I'm actually just finishing off writing my master's project. I was interviewing women in green jobs in rural areas and trying to identify barriers and incentives to employment in the area. And what's come forward is very much still this kind of cultural construct and really quite mundanely, access to childcare, such a huge issue, rather than that will or desire, anything like that. So I was just wondering, are you going to be structuring some of your questioning to kind of pick up the cultural points and how you might be approaching that part of the project?
Yeah, very, very much so. We're kind of going in with a very open mind about the decision-making process and the influences on that. And I think we kind of have we have an idea of some of the women that we might want to speak to. And we are trying to make sure that we have a diversity there in terms of what we think their backgrounds and, you know, the sort of contextual backgrounds might be that may have had an impact on them. It's very interesting that you say that it is still some of these more mundane things. That would not surprise me if we are again starting to see some of that in terms of men being the main breadwinner in the family, but the woman being the main housekeeper in the family. For, you know, and how do you then manage that process if you're going into not just a full-time job, but a full-time plus job in politics. Yeah, Alex, have you got anything to?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say as well, I think this is something that can be drawn out in the focus groups as well, because it's not just about sort of the ways in which women might have felt barred from participation. And I think exactly right. There could be cultural reasons, there could be family reasons, there could be, let's say, employment-related reasons, covering the broad spectrum of both domestic labour as well as other jobs that might interfere with that potential desire to run. But I also think it will be really interesting speaking to the families in the focus groups and seeing, you know, whether family members equally recognised the potential barriers that some of the women we speak to draw attention to. Because I wonder, and I'm not certain, but if maybe you might find that some of the barriers that women articulate to us are not necessarily as recognised by other people in the focus groups. And I think that's a really interesting point to pick up on. But yeah, I think generally speaking that the purpose of the interviews, the way in which we frame them, is to be very, very open. So we are asking set questions. Obviously, that's completely necessary for ethical reasons and to try and give some sort of reliable information. But we have a lot of questions that are there to enable a free flow, so to enable participants to put forward their own narratives. And therefore, it'll be really interesting to see if and when issues of culture are raised by participants, because I suspect they will be. But in one sense, I think we'll get the best information on that by leaving it as something they can raise through our open questioning. I hope that answers your question. I think it's really important to sort of pick up on the relationship between the interviews and the focus groups and what they might together tell us.
If I could just add on that, we added the focus group looking at the families really as a result of preliminary conversations with women in Manx Politics. You know, when they were talking about their journey and what was relevant to them, actually to them, their family, their connections were really important to them. So it's a deliberately non-atomized approach, really. So I think we might find some interesting things from there. One reason we opted for focus groups was we want to see what the discussion is between these different people as well. So we're hoping there'll be some really interesting data coming out of that.
Okay, thank you very much. And Adele, do you want to come back on that, or is that fine?
Yeah, just sounds fascinating. I'll definitely watch the project with interest, and yeah, it's just interesting to see how you tackle those kind of, I don't know, softer or kind of underlying causes that don't pop out quite so in your face. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that.
Thank you. And next we've got Ro. Ro's doing the Island Studies, and she's got very close connections with the Isle of Man, and she'd like to ask something. So on you go, Ro.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Hi, I found that absolutely fascinating. Yes, I have family on the Isle of Man that works closely in government. That's all I'm going to say at the moment. I've got a couple of, one is a question and one is information. I actually used to work for the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And I know we did some research on marginalisation in democracy. We did some at the Disability Rights Commission, but that was actually focusing on disability. And we also did it at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Having said that, that obviously related to the UK, and there are different political structures in the Isle of Man. I've sent a link, and I've sent Andrew quite a bit of links in terms of equality and democracy that the librarian from the Equality Commission sent to me this morning, and you might find that particularly helpful. A new paper has just come out yesterday relating to how women in the House of Commons are coping. That came out yesterday, and there's some very good recommendations there. Again, it doesn't relate to an island per se. So that's information. Now, having been living on the Isle of Man and still have family on the Isle of Man, the one question that fascinates me in terms of access to becoming a politician is the notion that, to a degree, there's a lot of people who are transient within the Isle of Man, that come and go within the financial sector, that move on. There's a percentage that actually acknowledges them as Manx residents and not Manx residents. And I've just been looking, very sadly, into the census, and that actually, oh gosh, I am really sad. And that's actually quite interesting. Are you taking that into consideration in your thoughts? You know, I must admit that when I was doing the governance, I did a comparative study of the Isle of Man, Faroes, and I think it was Åland, and that was actually quite interesting. Anyway, I'd be interested in all your comments. Thank you, and I'm enjoying the presentation.
I think there's two things I'd say to that. One of them is we're trying to keep the focus fairly tight on gender, because this is a one-year project and we want to produce sort of very concrete outputs. But you obviously can't just ignore everything else. So there's elements in our interviews, for instance, which are trying to tease other characteristics of particular respondents. We are planning for 20 interviews. We have a dream team of the 20 that we'd like to see. Socio-legal research being socio-legal research, we will not see all 20, but our dream team, we actually did take account things like, were you representing or interested in representing regional or urban, by which I basically just mean the Douglas seats, constituencies, but also whether the person identified as English or Manx. Or other. The other is very small until really the last two elections. So we are interested in that. There are restrictions on how long you have to be resident of the Isle of Man before you can stand for the keys, and they've been in place since the mid-20s. But there is still history of somebody who self-identifies as Manx-born, Manx-bred, Manx all the time, and somebody else who identifies as adopted Manx or not as Manx at all. So I think it's a really interesting topic, and we were seriously tempted to go deeper into it in the project design, but we've got 12 months and we want to make sure we deliver on what we're doing. Anything you'd like to add, Alex?
I think that sums it up nicely. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very good.
But nice to meet you, and thanks very much for the links.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I did nothing. It was the librarian at the Equality and Human Rights Commission who sent me them this morning. So, but if you want any more, quite happy to get them for you.
Thank you. That's very good to know.
Well, I don't think there are any other questions. I think people are going to be mulling over what you've said and taking away a lot of interest and excitement on the project, and thinking about how it might be relevant to their own island positions. So, and there we go. There's a Manx comment there for you. Thank you, Brisha. So I guess unless you have anything else that you'd like to say about your project or about potential connections between the Isle of Man and the Scottish Islands, we might round it up there.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
That's very useful.
Really useful comments. Thank you very much.
And well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you for sharing your research with us, and we look forward very much to reading the results when they're produced. And just personally, I think it's great that these lines of communication are established between our various islands, and hopefully we can build on these in future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.